Sub-Saharan Africa has coal, iron, gold, diamond, copper, tin, and so many other mineral resources that can be mined and exploited for revenue. Yet many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa do not have fully industrialized mining sectors. In many cases, there is more artisanal mining activity than formal activity. How can Africa take advantage of its natural mining resources for wealth generation? How can we take advantage of these resources for job creation? Today, we're looking at the prospects of mining in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. This is Business Edge. Joining me on today's Business Edge is Ted Bloom, Mining and Energy Advisor. Ted, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining us. So without going too much into other things, let's get straight to it. When we think of mineral resources, other than crude, I would say that we think of DR Congo, Namibia, Niger, Zambia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and so much more. We know Botswana is in the news because of that diamond. But when we also look at the economies of many of these countries, it's not gelling with the amount of money or the amount of revenue or whatever is going out in terms of the mining activities. What's wrong with our pipeline? What's wrong with our gold to wealth pipeline, our diamond to wealth pipeline, our copper to wealth pipeline? What's wrong with the pipeline?
Okay, so I think it's a political issue. And I've seen this in a number of jurisdictions around the world, is that governments typically choose one commodity. If they have commodities, if you're a rich, commodity-rich environment, they choose one commodity to be the backbone or the driver of the economy. For instance, for many, many years, for nearly 100 years, South Africa chose gold as our driver for our economy. I think Nigeria has chosen oil, Malaysia has chosen oil and gas, and Malaysia, prior to choosing oil and gas, was one of the wealthiest countries in the world in terms of tin mining. And they really, I mean, it's unbelievable. They shut down all their tin mines and they said, no, we're going to move people into oil and gas. And they even closed down the geology libraries. And when I was last invited over to Malaysia to see if we could regenerate their mining industry, I was gobsmacked to find out that they've abandoned all the history and data and experience in the mining industry. And I think it's the same thing in Africa, is we tend to take the easiest commodity and then everybody rushes towards that commodity and neglects the other sectors of the economy. And that's what happens, is that you get some people that do very well and are extremely wealthy if they got their fingers into that commodity, and the rest of the nation is left impoverished because those other sectors are neglected. And I guess it's called the commodity tax, or the rich man's tax, is that some people get very, very wealthy and the rest die in obsolescence.
And what you say is actually borne out by the data. So let me just give a bit more. So the mining industry, or the mineral industry in Africa, is actually the largest mineral industry in the world, with 11.73 million miles of land, implying large quantities of resources. Many of the countries are highly and dangerously dependent on mineral exports. You have mineral fuels like coal and petroleum accounting for more than 90% of the export earnings for Algeria, Equatorial Guinea, Libya, and Nigeria. Minerals account for 80% for Botswana. They use diamond, copper, nickel, and the likes. Congo Brazzaville, Congo Kinshasa as well. So with this concentration that we're seeing, why then are we not seeing an adequate value in given the investments we're seeing in the mining industry, especially from international and global miners? Why are we not seeing that reflected in the economies? You've answered it a bit when you say it's about politics, but if we're seeing that concentration and we're saying this is the one thing we want to concentrate on, why is that one thing not doing as well for us as it should be?
Okay, so I think the way to approach this is to do a scout around the world and see what other countries have done, other than African countries, in terms of the bonanza, because that's what it is, that we've been blessed with by God in our soils. And if you look at the Scandinavian countries, they had large tracts of oil and gas as well, and forestry as their drivers. And what they did is they created a sovereign fund. And what they did is they said, well, the normal return for investors in these industries is X, and you can make X, and whatever super profits you make goes into the sovereign fund. So instead of having a few greedy investors monopolizing the sector, the sovereign fund is boosted by the bonanza profits, and then that sovereign fund is used to develop other sectors of the economy. And I can give you a good example. Here in South Africa, we've got, besides the commodities boon, we've also got a boon which is directly correlated to so-called BEE, or Black Economic Empowerment. And for those who don't know, that we got laws in South Africa which says that every single business has to have a black component of at least 26%. And in most instances, those shares are not paid for. They're given away for free because the recipients claim that they don't have money to pay for these shares. And what happens is the favorite few, or the favorite dirty dozen, who are all politically connected, are now the BE shareholders in most of the companies, and certainly the large companies. And they are billionaires and multimillionaires, and the money then goes into their private pockets and doesn't go into a sovereign fund, which can then have been used to benefit the populace. And I think the similar thing has happened in your country. You've got some super wealthy people, and I happen to know one of the wealthiest people in your country.
Okay.
And certainly that didn't come from commodities, but rather from the baking and milling industry, as far as I know. But similarly, in the rest of the continent, I mean, like for instance, in the DRC, everybody knows that the Kabilas have made fortunes and fortunes, and the rest of the population are dying of starvation. So really what we need some sort of governance structure that it needs to be demanded by the populace to say that, listen here, people, these commodities belong to the people and to the earth and to the future generations. They don't belong to the current caretakers of that. And in fact, there was an article in one of the East African newspapers because the Australian Prime Minister, Mrs. Gillard, I don't know if you remember, about 8 years ago, she said to the mining companies, you don't own the minerals, the people own the minerals, you are the mere custodians at the moment of the minerals and the mineral wealth of this country. And she was referring to Australia. And I quoted her and said exactly the same for Africa. We are the custodians of the future generations who must all benefit from the vast mineral wealth that Africa's got. And it mustn't just go into the pockets of the few.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you bring up the pockets of the few. So let's look at the mining boom that African countries, mineral-rich African countries, really enjoyed between 2002 and 2012. Metal prices, oil prices nearly tripled. Companies were also very much competing furiously for new mines to meet the growing global demand. As a result, you found a number of African nations that found themselves in stronger bargaining positions with foreign investors. But a lot of people would question whether or not we adequately took advantage of that boom, and did we learn? Because there are a lot of questions as to how African countries give away so much rights and not get as much back when it comes to these investment deals. Many of us don't have the capacity to invest, to exploit, and to mine the way international mining companies do. And when we sit down at the negotiation table, it doesn't seem like we're coming with a very strong positioning. What do you think about that? Is there a way for us to change that puts African countries in a more driving seat sort of mentality when they're striking these deals?
Man, there is a recipe that one can follow, and I think Botswana has followed that recipe to a large extent. And that is the way that mineral rights are dealt with. So in Botswana, if you apply for a mineral right, and the reason I can talk about that is because I've got personal experience, is you apply for a prospecting or exploration license for a period of time. At the same time, you're not allowed to sterilize that right forever. You have to hand in periodic progress reports. You've also got to dedicate and allocate a budget to your efforts. So you can't sterilize a right and then sit on it for 5 years and do nothing. because then the government will just let that license lapse and reallocate it to somebody else. That's the one thing. The second thing is that the government also then needs to negotiate a participation in the exploration or the development of the project. And I see Mali as an example. Mozambique was an example until they got greedy. But Mali has just got, with their current mining efforts with the Chinese, they've got a 10% free ride, which is just a tax for another name for a tax. And then they've got a right to participate at a paid value for another 10%. And I really think that what the governments need to do is that they need to properly allocate those income streams to further development and exploration of the land that they have. For instance, in Botswana, just to go back to that example, they have a library, a world-class commodities library with archives of all the exploration work. So when you do exploration in Botswana, you have to make 3 copies of the documents. The one goes to the licensing officer, the other one goes to the library, and then you can work off the 3rd copy of your results from your exploration efforts. And then other people can have a look at what you've done in the libraries, openly and freely accessible, and that builds up a database of the reserves of commodity exploration results in the country. I mean, the results I looked at were done by Shell in the 1950s, and whilst they weren't using the latest technology, at least it gave me a measure of confidence to apply for a new license over the same area that Shell had abandoned because they lost interest after they did the exploration. But at least I didn't have to start off with no information. And that information, the government can use it as a trading point to negotiate its way onto the table and say, well, that's my contribution to this mining effort. And in return for that, I want some shares and a right to participate in more shares at a discount or at asset value or whatever. Okay. But a lot of the stuff, the people that govern the countries, they say, no, if you want to have these permits and stuff, you need to pay my family member or my back pocket or my Swiss bank account. And that's what impoverishes Africa, is because when it comes to the table, greed overcomes everybody, and the country ends up worse off.
Very, very true. Greed overcomes everyone and the country ends up worse off. So one of the other issues you find around the mining activity on the continent is artisanal and small-scale mining. Communities that are mining without technology, without protection, without exploration, knowing how far they're going, but they're also mining for themselves to put food on the table. Is there any way, when you look at the spread of everything across the Sub-Saharan African continent, to bring this artisanal mining, this small-scale mining, into a more regulated, formal fold? So that the communities do not lose out, and so that they can also do employment and also benefit from this mineral that's being mined in their vicinity?
So I think that artisanal mining is a great contributor to what would normally be exploration by the large majors. And it's unfortunate that when the majors come in, they tend to bully everybody else out of the way because they say that they're providing all the capital. But once again, there should be some arbitration process within the country to say, yes, it's now time to upscale this artisanal mining to industrial scale mining. But there needs to be some formula, I guess, to at least compensate or allow further participation of the artisanal miners and their communities, because a lot of the communities also suck the hind teeth, so to speak. And in fact, at a mining conference to be launched later on this month, I will be applied to be a contributor, where I will argue that one of the quid pro quos that needs to be put on the table for these large mining companies to get the licenses is that they need to outsource 99% of their procurement to locals, so that the value chain can be established and that the locals can benefit, and that by the time the mining is finished, there is a sustainable economy left behind that will benefit the people of the country. This story of rape, and escape, that's no longer acceptable in Africa. We need responsible mining, we need development of people, and we need to just put a mechanism there, because the miners themselves come with dollar signs in their eyes, and they want to get whatever they can get at the cheapest sort of cost. And I'm not saying we just make it expensive for them to mine, because then they'll just go somewhere else. But we need a framework that works for everybody. And to the extent that the minerals and the commodities belong to the geographic area, the people living there and that have title to that area should certainly be looked after in a compassionate manner, and not in a greedy manner.
Okay, let's talk about the pricing for these mineral resources that we exploit. Companies come to exploit from us and then take to the international markets. We're not involved in setting the price. It's beyond our control. But when you look at organizations such as OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, you see that they're able to set the price. And then you add the plus and those who are sort of outside that conversation. But is there a way for African countries to come together and sort of be more involved or influence more the pricing of commodities that are coming from their soil?
Okay, so I think one needs to differentiate between the different types of commodities. A lot of commodities are traded on the London Metal Exchange, and that gives a market price. For instance, gold is traded on the LME, and there's a morning fix and an afternoon fix, and that is largely determined by supply and demand, although there are people who say that it's an artificial market, and it's ruled by the banks, but there is some semblance of supply and demand balance at the LME. And the LME also caters for lots of the industrial minerals as well. But I think what is of more importance and of ethical proportions is the issue of transfer pricing. So what you find is these conglomerate miners come in, they then mine the products, and they then on-sell it to their own company in a tax haven at an artificially low price. Okay, so that minimizes their tax that they pay in the country where they are mining. And then they take the profits from the artificially low price to the market price in a tax haven where they again don't pay taxes on the profits. And that is rife throughout the world. And I can name some of the biggest mining companies in the world who are very guilty of what they call transfer pricing. It's actually a criminal act in most entities, but unfortunately the third world countries don't seem to have the mechanism to police these players and to see and identify artificial transfer pricing. I mean, we even have it in South Africa, and I have played a small role in trying to identify some of the transfer pricing, but it happens, it's pervasive, and it happens all over the show. I mean, one way that it happens, for instance, because out of the diamonds that come out of the Congo, is that they get shipped to adjacent countries that have a minimal record of diamond mining, and then they get sold there on the black market. So the whole transaction escapes the tax net. And in other words, the money that should be for the benefit of the whole population is again extracted without paying the fair dues and goes into the pockets of the few. I really think that if we can just pin down, and in the commodities arena, that's a problem for Africa. Believe you me, in the high tech and, for instance, the internet economy, it's a problem even for the first world, because there are internet transactions that take place in space, and the country where the money comes from doesn't necessarily get the taxes that they would have gotten if the internet service was domiciled in their country. So this is not just the Africa problem. Africa, it relates directly to commodities, and I can help sort that out if people and countries and governments want want me to help them. But believe you me, it's also a global problem in not the commodity sphere, but in the IoT, the Internet of Things domain.
Okay.
And that hasn't been solved yet.
All right, Ted, we have to go, unfortunately, but I have still many questions because we also want to look at our relationship, African countries and their relationship with China, which is largely the largest market for minerals globally. And if that relationship might not start seeing some mineral resource swapping for some of the debts that we have, but that may be a futuristic conversation. But before we wrap up, I just want three things from you. What do you think African countries need to do primarily to get more earnings from mining, from the mining of resources, mineral resources in their domain? Just three things.
Okay, it's very simple, ma'am. And thanks for posing the question to me. You make more money out of the value chain than you do out of the actual mining itself in most instances. Let me give you an example. Italy has got no gold mines. Yet Italy's biggest performer in terms of beneficiation is gold into necklaces and jewelry. So they make far more money out of making jewelry from the wrought gold than what South Africa makes from mining the gold. So I think beneficiation is critical. And in the case of most minerals, you need electricity to beneficiate the products, whether it's iron, ore, or whether it's coal, or whether it's other group metals. You need electricity of some sorts to do the beneficiation. So I think a prerequisite for getting more revenue in-house is to enable beneficiation, and the way to do that is to do energy projects. And that's why I cover mining and energy, because I think they go hand in hand. You cannot make money from mining if you don't have the ability to beneficiate the products.
All right. Ted Bloom, thank you. I'm very sure this won't be our only conversation as we continue to look at exploring mining and the potential for it to help grow Sub-Saharan Africa's economy. We appreciate your time today.
Oh, you're most welcome anytime. And there's a big role for collaboration amongst African countries. Our time has come. We need to make use of that.
All right. Thank you so much, Ted. And I think he says it best. Our time has come and there is room for collaboration between African countries. And we hope to be able to facilitate those kind of conversations and collaborations right here on Business Edge. We'll be wrapping things up with nothing else but NC4 to watch. So just take this quick breather with me and we'll get into the four stories we're keeping our eyes on. And of course, as we wrap things up, let's give you NC4 to watch. We start in the eastern part of the continent, where Kenya is on the verge of joining the League of Nuclear-Powered Nations. This follows the progress made by the country in implementing the recommendations of an earlier International Atomic Energy Agency Nuclear Infrastructure Review mission. Now, a team of IAEA and international experts say Kenya, which has Africa's 7th largest economy and a population of 52 million people, is considering the proposal of the Kenyan Ministry of Energy to introduce nuclear power to help meet its growing energy demand. Nigeria has borrowed 1.3 trillion naira since 2017 to ensure that generation companies and gas suppliers receive enough payment to continue generating electricity, according to the World Bank in its Resilience Through Reforms report. Now, the report also says the power sector in Nigeria will cost the federal government an additional 3.08 trillion naira through 2023 if current performance levels and low tariffs persist. Amazon Incorporated's planned new Africa headquarters in Cape Town is to draw demonstrations as indigenous people protest its construction on a heritage site. The march was organized on a South African public vacation day, and that was Youth Day, which commemorates the 1976 Soweto uprising of school children against apartheid education policies. And finally, the debacle surrounding South Africa's bid to secure emergency power supplies has highlighted a dysfunctional energy policy that's subjecting the continent's most industrialized nation to intermittent blackouts. Since March, the Energy Department has identified companies it wants to provide almost 2,000 megawatts of electricity to the grid by August of next year. But a losing bidder has alleged that the selection process was corrupt and sought to reverse it in court, with environmental activists raising objections and lawyers are at odds over whether ship-based power plants can be moored in the nation's ports. And that brings us to the end of Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining us. At News Central TV is where you can find us on our social media platforms. You can also find us online, YouTube, our website. We will come to your television on Star Times 274 and Avo TV channel 23. Many thanks for watching.